We are here tonight, as you know, to celebrate this wonderful book by my colleague Chris Mays, Unsettling Food Politics, Agriculture, Dispossession and Sovereignty in Australia, and to talk about all sorts of issues that arise out of that book. Chris has copies of the book available here at a very special price, so if you would like to buy a copy of the book, please see Chris after the discussion tonight. And as well as the usual rich array of debate and conversation, we have some very, very special additional reasons for you to stay with us after this panel discussion ends tonight. We have some catering, Postcolonial catering by Mabu, Torres Strait Islander Catering Company, and some very special wine, very generously brought to share with us all by Stefano. So thank you very much, Stefano, for that. I'm sure that will make an impact upon people staying rather than dashing at the end of the talk. And we're very, very grateful tonight to the Alfred Deakin Institute, who are co-hosting this event and making the Mabu food available for us. Before I introduce tonight's panel, let me begin by acknowledging that we meet tonight on the customary lands of the Wurundjeri. Let me also acknowledge the violence inherent in the dispossession of those people and their practices of tending this land. These are the issues that we're here to talk about tonight. And indeed, one of the compelling lines of argument of Chris's book is the perspective that he gives us on colonial violence as a battle over the feeding of hungry people. It's not necessarily the line on colonialism that we normally hear. Lauren, hello.
Hi.
Welcome. Please. It's wonderful to see you. If it's hard to make your way through, please make your way around the other way and come and have a seat or grab a glass of water on the way if you'd like one. So Chris draws our attention to pressing questions to be asked of the past as well as the present. Whose stomachs will be filled? Whose food will they eat? And why are they hungry in the first place? These are some of the questions, very stimulating questions at the centre of his book. So I'm going to briefly introduce our panellists in the order in which they're going to speak tonight. We've got a fabulous panel, quite a different kind of panel for the Institute. And let me say we're particularly delighted, of course, to have Stefano de Pieri joining us here, restaurant extraordinaire of Stefano's restaurant in Mildura. And Stefano, some of you will know, was last year awarded the title of Legend by the Age Good Food Guide. I'm not sure how many people can speak with such a title. Stefano, beyond his restauranting work, is an extremely active member of the Mildura regional community through the arts and many other aspects of that area as well. We're really delighted to have you with us, Stefano, and particularly grateful to you for making the journey all of that way and for bringing your lovely wine. Lauren Rickards, Lauren was going to speak second, but I might actually bump her down the line so she can just get herself in here in a timely way. Nick Rose, sitting next to me here, is the Executive Director of the National Sustainable Food Systems Organisation, SUSTAIN, the Australian Food Network. And from 2010 to 2015, he was the co-founder and national coordinator of the Australian Food Sovereignty Alliance. Nick lectures in food politics, food movements and food systems at the William Angliss Institute. I will introduce Lauren, even though she's not yet with us in the room. Lauren Rickards is an interdisciplinary scholar who's long worked on agriculture and food and their two-way relationship with environmental and social change. She's a co-leader of the Climate Change and Resilience Research Program at the Centre for Urban Research at RMIT, and she's also a lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And finally, the author of The Night, the man whose work we're here to celebrate, Chris Mays, is an Australian Research Council Fellow based at the Alfred Deakin Institute at Deakin University. Chris's interdisciplinary interests include the sociology of food and health, bioethics and political theory. As well as being the author of the book at the centre of our discussion tonight, Chris is the author of a second book, The Biopolitics of Lifestyle, Foucault, Ethics and Healthy Choices. And as I've said, he has copies of this wonderful book available, plenty of them, in the room next door at a bargain price for any who's interested. Now, before I throw to Stefano, I just want to underscore that we're trying to do something a bit different here at the Institute. For those of us who are based in universities, it's very common to come along to seminars and hear anthropologists and scholars speaking their kind of highly obscure language to each other around all sorts of themes. Here at the Institute, we're really seriously committed to getting a different kind of discussion going between scholars and people in all sorts of communities of interest around matters that matter to all of us in the present. So it's kind of an experiment. It's not always easy for academics to speak straightforwardly. We try. And so I'm particularly excited to see how this discussion unfolds this evening. Will you please make all of our panellists welcome? And we'll hear first of all from Stefano.
Well, thank you very much for that very generous introduction. Thank you all for coming tonight. I'm a little intimidated by the scholarship in this room, let alone the presence of some colleagues, if I can dare call them such, who are represent the genius, if you like, of gastronomy in Melbourne. So thank you very much for being here. I'm also pleased to be here because I just discovered, talking to Alison, earlier on, that this centre houses the complete collection of the poetry of my friend, my dear friend, the late Philip Hodgins. I don't know why it is here. I'd be curious to find out. But for those who are not familiar with this Australian poet, I think he is possibly the most interesting of our Australian pastoral poets. He died very young, at the age of 36, of leukemia, which he battled a long time, but left behind a wonderful body of work. And at the same time, as I acknowledge him in this room, in your presence, my mind connects also to the loss of Les Murray a few days ago, whose funeral is tomorrow, and I won't be able to attend. But with those thoughts in mind, let's talk about you. It is a cheerful segue because your book is a very important book. Now, I'm not an academic. I struggle with your book, particularly at the start. For those of you who will tackle, let me tell you, if you're not academics, don't get bogged on Foucault. Don't get bogged on French theory, and just keep pushing along. If I did it, you will be perfectly capable of doing that as well. Now, I must say to you, and you will explain yourself later, that I truly don't understand the necessity to recur to Foucault, because what you have to say is so important and stands, as it were, on its own right. It does not need, in my view, further theoretical justifications other than perhaps to justify your research wage. It's an important book. It is, in my view, and perhaps I should read more in this field rather than just cook food every day. It is, in a way, a compendium, a summa of the many arguments which today permeate the discussion on food. In fact, I don't think you've left a single stone unturned, whether it is the sheer history, the thread of colonial dispossession of Aboriginal people, whether it is the arguments about the justification for agriculture in Australia in the past and today, whether it is about the significance of alternative movements, both national and international. You've been able to weave an almost, there's nothing ever complete, but if there is such a thing, you have managed to journey us, the readers, through all the main arguments that are connected to and relate to the difficult position that we all have in relation to food and agriculture. We're all conflicted about it. And you point out the reasons why, and convincingly so, but you don't need me to tell you that. Point is that as you read the book and you wade through those arguments, sometimes you have to get out of the bog, sometimes it's an easy swim, but you are left with this difficult dilemma that when we do it, we are partaking in something that is not only historically problematic, to say the least, but it's contemporarily a difficult thing. That's why I cook every day, and I feel, when I think about it, and I try not to think about it, I drown my sorrow in booze most nights, but I feel conflicted, and I'm sure that everybody who is now working with food or consuming food has to feel conflicted, because we know that it doesn't come, with rare instances, it comes from questionable practices. It's a fact. I come from an area, and I'll narrow on mine and the things that I know a little bit. I had a lot of quotes here to read, but they're fabulous. Some of them are just the way you get stuck theoretically and very properly on some of the trends, the contemporary trends like farmers' markets, made me both smile with contempt and sorrow, because the people who are practicing these things do it with good heart. They do it with good intentions. But, you talk about the whiteness of these processes and these undertakings, and one wants to kill oneself, because it's very difficult, after you've done all the analysis, to find a plausible, reasonable collective out of the fact that when we need an orange, we've buggered up the Murray River. Well, we can praise the orange and say how good it is. We may even praise an organic orange, but it also used that water. And that water is being taken from nature, and nature is the basis of the life of many communities, particularly First Nation communities. And in fact, that water is probably the reason why they were quite deliberately decimated. There is I'm digressing now, but there's a beautiful work in the Mildura Art Gallery at the moment by, right now the name escapes me. Marie Clark. Who is there? Who knows? Marie Clark. And there's an installation of 400 hanging sticks in a kind of a bundle, at the bottom of which, as you look, there's a projection of her face. And I said, what are these sticks about? And then I read the notes, and they represent at least the 400 people that were shot along the Darling River by the pastoralists in the early 1830s and so on. It is as if, like the history of agriculture in my town begins magically about 1880, when Alfred Deakin decides that it's going to be settled by all these wonderful people from all over the world, blah, 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 blah. But what happened before? There is not even a complete history that I know of, at least, that deals with that period and its aftermath. I am going back to your book. It deals with all these issues, and it's very comprehensive. I was despairing towards the end because whilst you have all the analysis, all the insights, all the theoretical framework for anybody who wishes to undertake a project in the future, and you need that elucidation of all the issues, otherwise you work in the dark. I was hoping that there would be some examples of ways of doing things in an alternative, for use of a word that I don't really like, but of something that would indicate a way forward. You do show how to do it when you do it. I mean, your conversation on how to talk to one another in the last chapter is a beautiful, beautiful insight, and really quite moving. If we could all, regardless of where we come from or our history, to be able to not talk between deaf people, but to listen to one another and do it in that playful way that you are suggesting. I found that those pages very moving and very comforting. But I wanted to go to a little beyond all of that and see if there are some examples of alternative practices. So this afternoon I took myself over to the native title office, which is not far from here, in just a few streets up here, and found that there is quite a lot of stuff going on, particularly in the First Nations area. I found that there is a complete body of work being undertaken. If you're all interested, it's here on culture of water and what it means. I think it's formidable. There is precisely at this point in time at Melbourne University, so I know it sounds academic, but this is grounded in real communities claiming water. Because water is fundamental to the well-being of everyone. And when we talk about agriculture, water is number one. And when we're talking about justice, water should be number one before everything else. But we haven't found a mechanism to ensure that our people, our First Nation people, have access to water. The water is being sucked 24/7 by industry, by agriculture, leaving them with rivers that are dead, like the Darling right now as we speak. So to find a way to get a voice going and projects going that will impose on the politics of this country a way in which Aboriginal people can get back to their water is extremely important. Then I heard in another room at the same place that right now they were preparing a submission to set up 10 farms in Victoria for seeds, which are very rare and quite expensive. 10 farms run by Bruce Pascoe and Co. I think, I may be wrong, I may have got the name wrong. But there is a lot of stuff going on, which wouldn't happen and could not happen if there wasn't the kind of critique you bring to the fore. So there's, I think tomorrow they will start some cultural burning. I think tomorrow is Burn Day, probably the first time, sanctioned by the Victorian government. I'm not here to advocate for governments, God forbid, but there seems to be a bit of movement around creating these opportunities. There seems to be a little bit of money, and so I hope that, in essence, to end up my bit, that your framework and the practical approaches that people are going for now may result in some examples of some success in reinventing and the way in which we grow food and distribute it. Because at the moment, it's just going down the corporate path. Of course, there are always exceptions. There's an organic farmer here. somebody there, somebody in the city growing a little bit of food in the front yard and all that. But the bulk of it is in the hands of the corporates. And they got the water. And the water, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, used to be $40 a meg. It's now $600 when you rent it for a year. And if you want to buy it permanently, it's $7,000. So little farmers cannot afford it. And if you see them being grumpy with the Murray-Darling Basin plan, it's because they've been cut out of the market, cut out completely by the corporate interests. And this is yet another story that would deserve probably another seminar or a whole day conversation. Anyway, thank you very much. It's a great book, and I recommend it to everyone.
Good evening, everybody. It's a great honour and privilege to be here with you this evening, and I'm really grateful for the invitation and grateful for the opportunity. I just want to say that this book is important. I hope everybody here is going to walk away with a copy of it and read it as I have cover to cover. It's a really, really important work. I congratulate Chris on it. A great work of scholarship and very relevant to us at this time. So for me, it's really provoked a great many questions and reflections. I made many notes as I was going through it. And I can say as somebody who's got a strong interest in food politics, I am unsettled by the book. So if your objective was to unsettle food activists and food people who practice food politics, you've certainly achieved it with me, and I'm sure you will with anyone else who reads it. Many, many questions. However, in the interest of time and recognising the experience and wisdom that's in this room and wanting to have a good, strong sort of time for discussion and debate, I'm going to try and be as brief as I can. But also to be provocative, because I think, we're facing really urgent, critical challenges right now, and I don't want to beat around the bush, to use a well-worn cliche. I just want to try and get as close as I can to what I think, at least, is the heart of the matter from a personal perspective in terms of the really important questions that I feel I'm confronted with by this book, and I think are questions that we all need to be asking ourselves. So for me, as a non-Indigenous Australian of settler-colonial origin, of British ancestry, the first question this book raises is, what does that actually mean? What does it mean to be Australian? What does it mean to be a non-Indigenous European or British ancestry Australian at this point in time? And then related to that, and I think here we get sort of deep and philosophical and existential, but I think we need to be, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be alive right now as a human being in 2019 with the challenges that we're faced with? So as I've begun locating myself, who I am, where I'm from, I regard myself as a scholar activist. As Melinda mentioned, I work in a higher education institution teaching and researching food studies and food systems. I also run a national sustainable food systems organisation that is trying to shape and lead the conversation about sustainable food systems in Australia through events and research, as well as collective impact projects that seek to create real and meaningful change right here and right now. I was, as Melinda mentioned, and as this slide shows, one of the founders and prime movers of the Australian Food Sovereignty Alliance from its commencement in 2010 until I left at the end of 2015. However, I wish to make very clear that I'm not here as a representative or spokesperson for that organisation or for the food sovereignty movement in Australia, and nor do I regard myself as such a spokesperson or representative in any venue. However, I do claim authorship of this document up on the screen there, the People's Food Plan for Australia, which, as anyone who's read the book will know, or if you go to read it, Chris discusses that document at some considerable length in his critique of food politics and food sovereignty in Australia. I wish to say that I remain a believer and supporter of food sovereignty, of its vision and principles, as a global movement for transformative change in the food system, and indeed in its relevance for Australia. But I wish to acknowledge and accept fully the modifications that Chris has proposed in terms of grounding the practice and politics of food sovereignty in Australia in dialogue with Indigenous food sovereignty and Indigenous activists. So anyway, going on, in the interest of time, I just want to say, in terms of how Everyone comes with a story, I think, to this space. So my particular story in terms of, thank you very much, a moment of political awakening came from spending several years in Central America. Has anyone here been to Guatemala? A couple of you have been to Guatemala. All right, so if you've been to Guatemala, you'll probably know about some of the history of Guatemala, the raw and brutal impacts of the global imperialist and capitalist system. And here I'm talking about the power of the United States in that region, which has been exercised in many countries in brutal ways over the course of the 20th century. And right now, today, they are engineering a coup against yet another country in that region, Venezuela, which just happens, not coincidentally, to have the world's largest reserves of fossil fuel. So the story in Guatemala, which is told in that book, Bitter Fruit, has anyone heard of that book or read it? Another important book is the story of what happened to a government, a country and a people that tried to assert its national sovereignty and its sovereignty over its food system. I'm talking about the 1940s and 1950s, in this case through a program of redistributive land reform, taking away land that belonged to a major multinational food corporation, the United Fruit Corporation, and redistributing it to the poor indigenous majority, the Mayan peoples. And what that provoked was a ruthless and calculating embarkation of imperialist power, colonising power that would plunge that impoverished Central American nation into 4 decades of horrific and ultimately genocidal violence. And it wasn't just Guatemala, it was El Salvador, it was Honduras, it was Nicaragua, it was Chile and many other places, and primarily directed against, as I said, its indigenous peoples. So, while living in Guatemala and returning to study through Deakin University, actually, that I learnt about the work of this gentleman, Ghassan Hage. Some of you may have been here in this very room last week at this time, when Ghassan Hage was offering a bit of a reprise of his work from the 1990s, very prescient as it turns out, just writing at the time that John Howard came to power. So through Ghassan Hage, this is in 2003 and 4, I read about how our paranoid nationalism and what he calls our invasion anxiety expressed itself through our relentless and vicious persecution of refugees and asylum seekers, which has now, I think to our shame, become really a matter of political consensus and common sense across the political spectrum. So I realised at that point that there's something, I think, rotten at the core of the Australian body politic, and it is, I would suggest to you, a profound racism, born of the original foundations of this nation in dispossession, violence and ultimately genocide, which Chris documents in some detail and depth in his book. So that brings me to my first question that I posed to you. What does it mean to be a non-Indigenous Australian at this time? Chris writes of the process of colonisation in Australia as an attempt to establish a sense of home and belonging, and of the central role that agriculture played in that process, and what he terms, referencing Foucault, the governmentality of improvement. He notes that the cultivation of a sense of belonging is a constant work in progress, and that in this century, the 21st century I'm talking about now, public campaigns celebrating our multicultural society are harnessed in its service. Referencing surf lifesavers, and in parenthesis I'll mention that my dad was a surf lifesaver, a life member of the Cottesloe Surf Lifesaving Club for 50 years, one of only a handful. He writes of the beach as a place of belonging for white bodies in the establishment of what he calls the ontological proprietorship of white Australia. But even 231 years later, white Australia is still anxious about its status, our status as an occupier. We are suffused with what Ghassan calls a paranoid nationalism and an invasion anxiety. And here Chris points to an unease and discomfort that pervades settler-colonial Australia today, precisely because we have this ongoing and nagging doubt as to whether we really belong here at all. I have to say that I share this doubt. I want to tell you that I feel highly ambivalent about being Australian. I feel ambivalent, actually, full stop, about national identities, period. I feel much more attracted to cosmopolitanism, having lived half my adult life outside Australia and with an abiding love of travel. But as regards Australia and non-Indigenous Australians, my view is that we will only truly feel at home here when we face up to the long-delayed task of truth-telling, to their histories of violence and dispossession. In Guatemala, they call this the recovery of historical memory, and this is part of the great service that Chris has done for us all with this book. Only with a full and honest accounting of the past can we lay the foundations, I think, for an authentic process of reconciliation, healing and forgiveness with First Nations peoples. which I believe must be expressed in a treaty. Only then can we actually begin, I think, to fully mature as a society and perhaps truly to feel at home here. So much for what it means to be Australian. What then, the second question, what does it mean to be a human alive at this time in 2019? Well, for me, I think it means embracing the task that the great American ecological theologian Thomas Berry expressed in these terms in his final work, his final book, The Great Work. And as he says there, our challenge is, as we move into this new millennium, is to carry out the transition from a period of human devastation of the earth to a period when humans would be present to the planet in a mutually beneficial manner. And I would suggest not just present to the planet, but present to each other. Non-Indigenous Australians present to Indigenous Australians, and Europeans and people from the global north present to people in the global south. Human devastation of the earth is present everywhere and anywhere we choose to look. Now, I'm sure some of you will be familiar with this image taken earlier this year from the Lower Darling River, the Menindee Lakes. These two local farmers weeping as they held those decades-old Murray cod in their hands, the result of one of a number, as it turned out, of fish kills on the Lower Darling, due, I think, primarily to over-extraction of those sacred waters from the cotton industry. I'm sure many of you have heard of Cubby Station, Australia's largest cotton farm, with rights to extract the volume of water every year that sits in Sydney Harbour, some 540 billion litres. And we've heard about this this very week also. One of the reasons why this session is so timely. Some of you will have seen on Monday the release of this world first report, a synthesis of over 4,000 studies from the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, with the headline figures saying that over 1 million species are facing extinction in the next few decades. They put the finger of blame for this state of affairs firmly at the foot of agriculture and food systems, land clearing primarily and overfishing. In terms of what the solution is, how do we go from a place of devastation to one of harmony and reparation? They say this: we need to redefine human well-being beyond its narrow basis on economic growth. We need to engage with multiple public and private actors. We need to link sustainability efforts across all governance scales. And most importantly, for our purposes tonight, we need to elevate Indigenous and local knowledge and communities. So this challenge, I think, is an existential one, as I framed it in both material and philosophical terms. I want to say that we need to embrace, embody and enact a paradigm shift as individuals and as a collective. We have to see, think and act as though we are embedded in and of this earth and all its life forms, and not as though, according to the book of Genesis, we are somehow separate from it and therefore can endlessly exploit and degrade it as we have been doing. So for me and many others, this paradigm shift means, I think, a complete transformation of our political economy. And here I'm talking about the C word, capitalism. It has, I would suggest to you, long outlived its utility. We have reached what Canadian professor of philosophy John McMurtry called in this book from 20 years ago, the cancer stage of capitalism. And what he means by that, you can see up there, in my paraphrase, synthesis of it, he says that we in the living planet of which we are part are the life host for an unregulated and metastasizing system that feeds on the nutrients with which we provide it. It knows no limits, it has no respect nor commitment to the integrity of us or the living planet of which we are part, and it will not stop until it kills us and much of the living planet. And further, this system is protected by a prevailing taboo in the media, as well as political and economic discourse in which its name cannot be spoken, nor its goals seriously questioned. Being unable to identify and recognise the disease that afflicts us, we cannot pursue effective remedies. So, Chris, in his book, detects the key themes in the literature on Indigenous food sovereignty, in which he says that food sovereignty in Australia must engage in respectful dialogues, including decolonisation, resistance against global capitalism, and the resurgence of Indigenous ways of life. All of these, I believe, offer key entry points for respectful dialogue between non-Indigenous and Indigenous food sovereignty proponents. A key need and opportunity, it seems to me, is to articulate a post-capitalist and post-growth vision and goal for our society. In Ecuador, they call this sumac kosai, from the Quechua language. It translates in Spanish as buen vivir, which awkwardly translates in English as living well. Living, it's grounded in Indigenous cosmologies and values of conviviality, reciprocity, care and abundance. Elements, I think, that we desperately lack in mainstream Australia in 2019. So I want to finish now with a couple of examples of what this might look like in contemporary Australia. So some of you might have seen this story from the Guardian newspaper in the last week. It came out actually on Friday, 26th of April. This is the Yerrabingan Indigenous rooftop farm, a 500 square metre garden containing 200 native plants on top of a Mirvac building in the Everleigh Industrial Park. The very first such garden of its kind in Australia, run by an Indigenous enterprise. Now, they point out in this article that the market for bush foods is growing rapidly, but here we talk about food sovereignty and who controls and benefits from that market. Because even though that market's going rapidly, according to Christian Hampson, one of the two gentlemen in that image, only 3% of bush foods is actually supplied by Indigenous controlled and owned enterprises, 97% by non-Indigenous companies. So there's a clear issue of equity and ownership and control here as our taste for bush foods expands. And finally, I just want to finish with this as an example of what I might call a sharing and reciprocal economy. In that image up there on the right, we have an organic dairy farmer, Vicky Jones, who runs and owns 650 acres of farmland in Longwarry and Cockatoo out past Pakenham in Cardinia and Baw Baw Shires. And what she has done through relationships and networking is get in touch with dozens of families from 5 different African nations who are living in Pakenham and its surrounds. And she's made available an acre of her land, and it's led by women. They've been bringing their families there for the past 8 weeks, planting their food crops, sharing their land, dancing, singing, drumming, and weaving a spiritual connection to their land at the same time that they are growing healthy food for their children. It's a powerful glimpse, I think, into what a better and sharing and solidarity food economy might actually look like. And you can be part of it. If you are interested, this very Saturday they are having a harvest festival in Longwarry from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. Everyone is welcome to be part of that experience. So I'll finish there. Thank you.
Great, thank you everyone, and apologies again for being late. So I'm speaking here today as a cultural geographer, so that's someone who's interested very much in the way our ideas, our metaphors, our symbolic structures and metaphors all intersect with space and co-produce space. And to me, Chris's book, although he doesn't have I think geography, or should I say license card, cap. Chris's book is very much a geography book. So I'll forge on even without the slides. Oh, here they are. Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you. And so one of geographers' favourite words after space is that word place. And what Chris's book does very well is it sets a place, it emplaces food. It asks us to ask a lot of questions about the spatial location of food. I might swap with you, yeah. Now, one of the sort of, I guess, expected ways in which we've come to associate space with food is we ask the question, where did my food come from? And there's a whole lot of educational work about educating children, educating your sort of basic mum and dad consumer in the supermarket aisle about this question of where food comes from. And there's a whole lot of technology, apps, ICTs, and a whole lot of branding that goes behind that. And that is important. It does help us to locate certain foods. And there's also a whole lot of food-based systems, such as farmers markets, for example, that allow those of us who are interested in that to connect directly, as well as the image there from Aussie Farmers Direct. But what Chris's book does very usefully is to move us beyond this connection between a food product and a place, because it asks us to think on a much, much bigger arena. So what we're talking here is about moving away from food products, moving away from individual farmers to talk about agriculture as a whole, as an enterprise, a human activity. And when we do that, we start to see just how highly political and social and cultural agriculture is. And we start to see what it looks like in the very particular context of Australia. And in doing so, it offers a lens not just on food, but onto a whole lot of issues that we've already started to hear about from Stefano and Nick today. So I'm really interested in the way Chris usefully uses food as a lens, and he uses a lens to highlight what from a geographer perspective can be thought of as a whole lot of sort of mental maps, if you like, and a lot of these maps have actually been cast on paper in very political acts of cartography. So this is from a British textbook for kids about exploration and colonisation, and those words are used unashamedly to map the great journeys and adventures of all of the explorers that most of us here were probably brought up having to memorise. You know, who was it that discovered this, and what happened to this one, what happened to that one? That was very much part of our education. And it also starts to get at some of the other less spoken maps. And this one from Griffith Taylor, the Habitability map from the 1930s. And you can see there the sort of thinking that underlay this intense need to continually traverse across what was obviously difficult to traverse country, trying to find the good bits, if you like. And we came up with maps where we've got useless and useless, good, grazing, and then it gets to fair. And that's about as good as it gets, fair agricultural lands. And then there's a lot of other mappings that went on. So there's no sheep, some sheep, and a bit of wheat. Now, the thing about all of this is these are not just horizontal descriptions. This is very much hierarchical categories. And the normative language of useless is very much part of this. And so we start to see this ranking and this judgment through which the Australian continent has been seen. And it's very much through that lens of agriculture that that judgment has been foisted upon the continent. And so then we get to today, and this is quite a contemporary map from 2010, and it actually maps out different types of agriculture. And to make it easy for you, the white bits are non-agricultural. So everything else is agriculture.
Quite like other land uses.
Yeah, so it's agriculture and other, exactly, that's a very important point. So it's other land uses, and then there's a gradation, and that gradation does make a certain sense from an agricultural perspective in terms of different enterprises, but again, it's very much a continuation of this hierarchical ranking of different areas of land according to the intensity of the agricultural production that it can support. And so you've got grazing native vegetation where you pretty much don't do anything except whack in a few water holes and then go around and sort of count your stock, dead or alive, by helicopter. You've also got then grazing modified pastures, so you make a bit of an effort to grow them some food, and then you go through cropping and horticulture and intensive as well. So there's very much a sense of this parallel between the amount of effort that land deserves, if you like, and the sort of intensity of food production that can come out of it. And that's reflected, I could equally have talked about economic measures as well. And what's hidden by all of these maps that have become layered and layered upon our Australian national consciousness are these sorts of much, much more diverse maps. So this, of course, is the different Australian language groups of all the different Indigenous groups in Australia. And not only that, that's sort of bright and pretty. It looks a bit like the Sustainable Development Goals, really, which is why the Coalition dissenting report on Australia's position on Sustainable Development Goals complains that the UN's become a left-wing think tank. It's good reading if you're interested in reading Australian government documents. But what's lost behind the pretty colours is, of course, this. And this is a map of the different massacres that are known to have taken place across that continent as well, in the making of that agricultural land, even in the useless areas, if you like. So you can see here the layering of these maps and the way some are hidden and some are very much brought to the fore and formalised. I also want to point out that also lost behind a lot of these formal maps are some of these types of diversity. This is about bioregions, which is just put up here as an indication of the rich biodiversity that, of course, Indigenous life is so entwined with. So that too is very much lost in those maps of useless or habitability, sheep or wheat. We get none of this. Likewise, below the surface, there's this rich mapping that can occur of all the different groundwater into resources, if I dare use that word, but the groundwater features of Australia, which are these incredibly rich topographical spaces with lives of their own, but again only exist where they come up through points of pipes in the soil to actually feed those sheep, to actually contribute to some of that horticulture. And so I want to make 4 observations, and clearly Chris's book provokes many, many observations, as Nick said, and these 4 just simply speak to some of my own preoccupations as a scholar. The first is that what we're seeing here is not just an overlay effect. So the sorts of maps that I've presented here do give you a sense of a kind of GIS type. Anyone here do GIS? It's all about layers, spatial layers. You add them on, add them on, add them on, and then you sort of put a pinpoint through and work out what intersects with what. So there's definitely an element by which we need to layer those maps and to see what is and isn't seen by in those different layers. But at the same time, agriculture is not that simple. And it's already been alluded to with Stefano's discussion of irrigation, Murray-Darling Basin. And this is the Coleambally irrigation district, where my family was surprised to find themselves camping over Easter. The choice of the farm, the cotton farm we camped on, was not coincidence. I was doing a little undercover research. Why are we swimming in the irrigation ditch? I was like, oh, this is so fun. Anyway, that's what happens. So what we're talking about here is a much, much more complex position. It's indirect spatial dispossession as well, and water, as Stefano pointed to, is one of the very, very key aspects of that too. But let's not forget that agriculture cannot be divorced from the settlement patterns, the general settlement patterns of Australia as well, the rural settlements as well, the towns, etc. All the infrastructure, most of which is eroding now, which I want to come back to at the end. But that's very much part of it as well. And, then we just need to think about the kind of inputs that most agriculture uses, particularly on the intensive side, and see that the many distant locales are very much implicated in this too. And we could have a discussion about fertiliser and about the incredible spatial footprints of fertiliser that end up. So it's not just about the area of application on a particular farm where that's put on. The next one is it's not just about food. And I think this is particularly important in the context of climate change, where one of the major climate change adaptations that farmers are being encouraged to take on is to think of diversifying into non-food type products, and particularly non-climatic sensitive type products such as renewable energy. So if farms are to become a huge part of our renewable energy infrastructure, as in the site of energy generation, then what does that mean about that Indigenous connection? And so I've quoted Chris here, or paraphrased Chris, where he has a very a very pithy, engaged summary of his argument about if eating implicates one in agriculture, and agriculture is implicated in colonial violence, and eaters are implicated in this history. But what if we put in there energy users, and particularly networked electricity users? What does that mean? So it's not just about food. Yes, food is a particularly evocative one because of its embodied nature, because of its connections with health and culture in a way that electricity fails to achieve, though I want to come back to that, remind me. Yeah, what does this mean when we think about agriculture as a site of other products? Third, what about agriculture as not just a technical tool of dispossession, not simply a sort of bulldozer saying, you know, move away, the fence line's going in here, but actually a symbol at the heart of the distinction between what makes a civilised person versus an Indigenous person. So it wasn't that agriculture came in to a situation where those populations were necessarily already so hierarchically ranked and discussed, but it became very much part of the dialogue, part of the justification for the superiority of the white Indigenous, white colonisers in order to justify that dispossession. So it wasn't just a technical tool, it was very much a symbolic one. And this is very much part of this ongoing need to prove agriculture's professional status, its scientific status, its improved status. My DPhil at Oxford was about agriculture's anxiety complex. I didn't actually call it that. But it's very much about how it got into universities and then got booted out because they could never get rid of the whiff of manure. But generally speaking, it's tried very hard and successfully to become a scientific industry. Two elements of this are worth highlighting here just quickly, and I don't want this to become a lecture, but there is a very, very important point to be made here about the connection to the Cartesian dualism, which I'm sure many of you know, the mind-body dualism, which very much equates to the human nature one, civilised, uncivilised, cultivated, uncultivated. And Jason Moore would argue that that is very much at the heart of capitalism. Also at the heart of capitalism is, of course, the notion of private property, which John Locke, as Chris discusses eloquently in his book, pretty much put in place the kind of Christian Genesis story of the Garden of Eden as the basis for proving that someone who actually cultivates the land then becomes a more a civilised and mature, what does Nick Blomley call it, a mature and powerful individual. So there are very much deep, deep roots here, and that's the main point here, is that agriculture has deep symbolic roots here. It wasn't just a technical tool. And the last observation is that, and I think this picks up a little bit you know, something that I think Stefano and Nick were sort of gesturing to as well, that at the end of the day, well, maybe not at the end of the day, but at one moment in the day, we have to also acknowledge that there is a real similarity and solidarity between Indigenous people and rural people and farmers in that they are all marginalised, not equally marginalised, but nevertheless all marginalised by the urban master subject, to use that sort of terminology from Val Plumwood from the dualism, which is to say those who are considered most human are actually the city dwellers. It's the polity. And if we really, really want to start to make things positive and transformational change, then we have to look at that as well and not stop with agriculture. So Kay Anderson talks about the city as where people, in entering into distinctly non-natural relations, realise their full humanity among a set of relations that are absent in the wholly natural lives of other living things, whether those things are rural workers or Indigenous. Now, as I say, this is not to equate the two, but it is to point to a very important parallel. And one of the reasons it's important to point to that parallel is because we actually have to acknowledge the threats that agriculture is under. So one is a very, very clear spatial overlay type one, that sort of original idea that the city is coming. So this is urbanisation and the predicted loss of agricultural land in the peri-urban zone of Sydney between 2011 and 2031. This is another map, just to go back to that mapping of the continent, and these are our fossil fuel tenements. And this is the energy, the networked energy that currently underpins city life. And it's these sorts of maps and these sorts of distant processes of urbanisation that allow the cities to be lit up in a way that comes to symbolise true humanity, if not godlike status. And finally, this is a map where we extend out to the world, and it's an agricultural stress index. And I just simply want to note that Australian agriculture, according to this map, published in April 2019, is the most stressed of any place in the world. It's got the purples and the reds. And whenever we speak about agriculture, we cannot forget the empathy that's required in the context of that. Okay, thanks.
Wow, thank you. This has been a very, very stimulating set of talks. I'm sure we have a room full of burning comments and questions. But before I kind of throw open to the floor, I want to bring us back to Stefano's orange. I've not been able to get the orange you gave us out of my head through this whole series of provocations that we've had. And so I was thinking about what sorts of things sit with the orange and the dilemma and the hope that we might kind of spin off the orange. There's the mode of production, there's questions of ownership, there are supply chains. And Stefano, I wanted to throw to you first perhaps as someone who has such a strong sense of what a region is and the different kinds of relationships that constitute a region, to ask, do you have an idea of how it might be possible to intervene in the precarious state of the orange to bring about some kind of change?
Well, the orange goes back to water. I'm afraid it's the constant motif. And it's please, others can help in the answer because I'm not the only one. But I can testify to the fact that the orange contains water. It goes back to water and who owns it and what it's used for. Because one of the great things about this book, I go back to the book just for a moment because we have believed that narrative produced by the National Party particularly, that we are producing food for the world, that we have this obligation, as it were, this task, this national mission to be providers of food for the world. That justifies the orange, the cultivation of endless amount of oranges, which go mostly to, as the book says, to China, Japan, Malaysia, and so on and so forth. Now, that water has a cost, and the cost is decided by the demand, and the demand is growing continuously because the corporates are demanding more and more of that water, because with all these trade agreements, those oranges are fetching top dollars. There was a town, I mean, I can speak for hours about this, and I'll come back to the water, but for many years, most of us who live in that region would look at townships like Robbenville, if you ever heard of it, with a little bit of sort of, oh, the poor bastards over there, you know, they're doing it tough, especially during the drought and so on and so forth. Now with the trade agreement with China, they can't produce enough grapes to export. they're becoming millionaires. So all these migrant families that lived in poverty now have 67 bathrooms, 67 garages. It's just bizarre. It should go and have a look. I don't mean to denigrate it, because these people did it hard for generations. Now finally they've come onto the money, and they're not going to worry about our conversation. But the water is going to run out for them as well, because on top of them, there's the almond farmers coming along with the investment propped up by the Canadian Teachers Union or by the Californians who have run out of water. So their water has gone to $10,000 US per megaliter, which is an Olympic swimming pool of water. And here they can still have deep pockets to pay a premium price because the water is tradable. If you understand, the water is tradable. It's like shares. Any one of you can go to a water trader, any one of you, and buy water. And then that trader will lease it on your behalf to whoever wants it, pushing up the price. One of the issues, to me, which is what I also think other people are beginning to consider, is that whilst this is making a lot of people wealthy, the disconnection of water from land, that disconnection, in order to make a tradable commodity, is at the root cause of this problem. So maybe we have to start saying water should be reconnected to land. So if you have land, you have the water, but you can't trade it. Now this goes counter to every neoliberal principle, and of course there will be people pissed off as buggery about this because they would stand to lose a lot of money or they'll have to rejig their businesses. All of this happened whilst the city, as Lauren was saying, was basking in its own glory. And politically, a lot of you here are very astute people, but now I separate myself. I now go to the country and look at you. You delegated for years and years and years the discourse of agriculture to the National Party. You were quite happy to leave it there and have your political battles in the city. The cockies, well, some distant relatives maybe, some nice people with straw in the mouth. You know, yeah, they produce the lovely oranges and so on and so forth. Well, they've buggered you up now, and vice versa. So maybe the city has to take a much more keen interest in to begin with, to answer your question, in that orange, and ask a lot of questions about the environmental, social, etc., etc., etc. In the process, just to finish, Lawrence said that there will be people that are paying a price, the dispossessed of the white people as well. And there are those dairy farmers who cannot afford to buy the water at that price. And also because dairy farming, the way it was conceived, is a ridiculous idea. It's crazy. You know, how can you put river water on a paddock and grow it and then the cows shit all over it and trample and then produce milk for our cappuccinos? It's just insane.
All right. The floor is open. Questions, comments? Oh, sorry, Chris. Did you want to...
I did prepare just a page, but more than enough things have been said. No.
We're discussing another book.
Yeah. No. Well, more than enough has been said about me and the book. So I just want to start by thanking people. So a lot of it goes into writing a book and the acknowledgements to those people, some of whom are in this room, you can read at the start of the book. So I won't go into those people, but I wanted to thank about those who went into hosting this event. So Melinda and Carlos from the Institute, as well as Rima, who encouraged me right from the start to even have a book launch at various stages, kept on saying, when am I going to do this? And yeah, definitely to Stefano, Lauren and Nick for their generous and kind comments and willingness to come here, as well as to the Alfred Deakin Institute for supplying and paying for the catering from Mabu Mabu that we will have, and for Stefano and his wine. So I'll keep my comments brief, and then we can have a Q&A, and then we can have some of that wine shortly.
Murray River water.
Murray River water. As the flyer for this seminar said, had the question, is eating a settler-colonial act? And we've had a few mentions of that already. And I wanted to sort of, I guess, ask myself the question on your behalf, why did I pose this question? And I think decontextualised, it does sound a bit strange and even perhaps trivialises an important issue. But as mentioned, it's drawing on another phrase saying if you eat, you are involved in agriculture, which is a popular saying among some food activists, which expresses the idea that the decision of shoppers and eaters in urban contexts are in relationship with farmers and growers in rural and regional communities. Yet, so the argument goes, and as we've heard, the industrialised food system keeps eaters ignorant of the agricultural processes that go into producing their food. The ethical focus of that saying is on the obligations and responsibilities in the present of the eaters in relation to agriculture. So Wendell Berry and others contend that in thinking about eating as an agricultural act, eaters will make more responsible decisions that respect the environment, farmers, and animal welfare, among other things. However, as I argue in the book, eaters are also kept ignorant of entanglement of agriculture and settler-colonial violence. As such, this adage can be pushed further. If eating implicates one in agriculture, and agriculture is implicated in colonial violence, then eaters, not just farmers, are implicated in this history. So if you eat, you are involved in settler colonialism. But what are we supposed to do with this? Just as I don't believe we'll address climate change through consumer choice, I don't think we can solve legacies of colonialism and dispossession via consumer food choices. However, interrogating the histories and politics of these choices does open up ways of thinking and acting on the interconnection and entanglement of our everyday lives with the past and the present. So I also posed this question to historicise our food choices and culinary practices and to see them as political acts, even if we don't recognise them as such all the time. The sheep and the paddocks, the lamb chop and the lamington did not appear from nowhere. They have histories and they do work for our collective identity. Jean Brillat-Savarin, a famous gastronome, founder of that, is known for his aphorism, "Tell me what kind of food you eat and I will tell you the kind of man or person you are." Brillat-Savarin meant this in a much more expansive way than it's used today in the "you are what you eat," which is such an individualised way. Brillat-Savarin meant that one's diet, the kinds of food, how they are prepared, how they're procured, where they come from, reflects the society that one is part of. And this is made clearer in the aphorism preceding that one, which is, "The destiny of nations depend on the manner in which they are fed." The way we fed ourselves, and I think that "we" is, as Nick pointed out, is a very sort of pregnant one that we need to interrogate ourselves. The way that we fed ourselves in the past enabled production and reproduction of a settler-colonial white nation, while simultaneously limiting the capacity for Indigenous nations to continue feeding themselves, to have a continued destiny or future that was not severely disrupted. In thinking of eating as connected to settler colonialism, there is possibility for disrupting and denormalising these everyday practices, food practices. However, I recognise that there is a danger, and Lauren pointed this out as well, of focusing too much on food and eating. The focus on food already leads towards the individual consumer. I mean that in both senses, rather than the wider considerations of the food system. As Julie Guthman, a geographer and food scholar, observes, when food itself becomes the locus of social change, it tends to erase from consideration the countless ways in which the food system has gone awry socially and environmentally. So this book has tried to bring into focus the continued effect of settler colonial history on contemporary food politics and how this initial injustice continues to operate through an awry food system. Much of the book oscillates between the past and the present, or the near present, and perhaps, as Stefano said, oscillates between, what did you call it, a muddy bog and a smooth stream of, a muddy bog of Foucauldian theory. But knowing the past and its effect in the present is an important part of the critical approach outlined in the book. And to follow Michel Foucault, knowing how things are constituted is crucial for the political struggles to unconstitute the order of things in the present. And like Raj Patel, another food scholar, observes, those of us living, growing and eating in settler-colonial societies are the beneficiaries of stolen goods. He suggests we need to become historians of loam, historians of the soil, to remember the blood spilled in the past, which has allowed for benefits to be gained and enjoyed in the present. To adopt this perspective, what Foucault would call counter-history, growers and eaters may open up new possibilities for troubling and disturbing the normal order of things and develop counter ways of being and counter ways of procuring our food. However, it's also crucial that these counter ways do not remain symbols but have material and political effects. To the frustration of some, but I would say let's be realistic, I do not solve the problems of injustice associated with the way we grow, distribute or eat food. However, I hope that in this book I provide some clues as to how we may continue the struggle toward new openings and possibilities for individuals and communities to live lives that are not governed too much and that are not overly determined by forces that they have little control over. So thank you all very much for coming, and I think I'll have some Q&A.
Thanks very much, Chris. Fantastic. Okay, now the floor is open for comments or questions. And I'll invite you to please raise your voice very loudly, otherwise we'll run around with the microphone.
I don't know whether it's a question or more of a comment, but Lauren, thank you for those extraordinary maps. I just feel there was one missing, a map of historical hydrology, and maybe the hydrology now after, I think the previous conversations about what's happening at Guppy Station up on the northern New South Wales Queensland border is only one part of the story. The massive earthworks of profiteers excavating levees, temporary levees for flood water, but now become permanent levees, I think is one of the great sort of travesties, and it would be interesting to look at the current hydrology of how water flows through landmass. I think one of the great kind of tragedies is it's been mentioned, the lower Darling River, and it's not, I'm convinced, anything serendipitous like drought or the cycles of rainfall, but there clearly was a government decision taken sometime, a preemptive decision to in building a pipeline from Mildura to Broken Hill to cut off water in the lower Darling below Menindee. And that is the cultural highway for Barkindji First Nations people there. You know, the appallingly kind of superficial act of taking 50, 60 Murray cod fingerlings back to Sydney to safeguard the species. You know, that river provided a menu, a table, a full table of kind of crustaceans and freshwater mussels, and to that pathetic act, which will be all insulted really by that.
Absolutely. I mean, just briefly, the whole idea of plumbing Australia and plumbing the nation, which we've done to as greater extent as we can, and we will hear no doubt again about developing the north. It's kind of a discourse that comes out every decade, develop the north, get that abundance of water and put it in the dry bits. But yeah, the plumbing the nation notion or imagery or imaginary is very much part of that governmentality of improvement that Chris discusses. So it's very much part of it. One thing I would say is that coal mining, particularly, other types of mining, but coal mining especially, is hugely water intensive, as I'm sure anyone following the Adani mine controversy would know. So we need to keep in mind that the big corporate water users include but also extend far beyond agriculture. Mm.
John.
Thank you very much for the presentations. It's always dangerous putting up maps because you'll get told about all the maps you've missed out. And the map that you missed out for me was native title determinations and registered claims. So people in this room probably don't realise that 46% of the continent is now under Indigenous title. And when the claims process is completed, 70 to 80% of the continent will be under some form of Indigenous title. Now, those lands are firstly the most environmentally intact in the country because they historically had no commercial worth. But secondly, with those lands, Indigenous people get native title rights and interests. And one of the key native title rights and Section 2011 of the Native Title Act, is the right to harvest. Now, that term harvest is getting interesting interpretations in Southeast Australia, but where I live in North Australia, what that means is kill animals. Again, people here probably not aware there's 50 million macropods in Australia. And if we're talking about food sovereignty, returning native title rights and interests to Indigenous people, the way they'll exercise those rights, particularly in remote Australia, is by killing animals and eating them, which I guess what I'm trying to do here is move us beyond thinking about agriculture, thinking about not only the endemic species on this continent, but also the introduced feral animals that people also want to kill and eat. 24 million feral pigs, very tasty. 100,000 feral buffalo in Arnhem Land, very tasty. So there's another way, I guess, of thinking about food sovereignty, about the restitution of rights. Under native title law, Indigenous people also have unlimited rights to fresh water for non-commercial purposes. And if those rights are in contest with commercial rights, then maybe the native title rights are compensable. And we've had a recent case of compensation in relation to Timber Creek. So again, as a majority non-Indigenous nation, we need to be thinking about some of the bills that we might be getting as Indigenous people continue to assert their rights to native title lands, species, waters, and possibly reparation for past violence.
Would anyone like to respond to that?
I'd just like to channel my good colleague Libby Porter, who is very much a supporter of these native title development. Yeah, she would have put a native title map in, but she would also have pointed out that I think 97% of them are outside city areas, and so you still get this huge immunity for the urban master subject from these things.
Actually, that point about the urban master subject, I think, resonated very strongly for me because I live outside Melbourne. I live about 3.5 hours west of here in dairy country. I say that. And it's amazing. I was an invited speaker at a farmers' forum around food production and the future of food in the region. And basically, in that forum, it was a technological issue, as on an individual, capitalised agricultural basis. And then so I was actually speaking about possibilities of reconsidering farming and how to support farmers to do what a lot of them are interested in doing, which is much more sustainable, engaging with a landscape scale, like landscape sovereignty as a notion and so forth, which wasn't particularly popular with the Institute of Chartered Accountants. But it's surprising how many farmers I've had to come up and talk to me afterwards, and there's quite a diversity of farmers in that region. So I think there is an issue around having too much of the discourse held in Melbourne, and we saw a couple of weeks ago this very divisive farmers as bad guys narrative going on, and I just think some of that particular point you made in terms of recreating or regenerating landscapes that are healthier, more engaging with all people is probably for me the most important point.
Well, I mean, also the rural ideal and that kind of romanticised version of the farmer that we often like to replicate on rooftops with cherry tomatoes is very much an urban product as well. That's for us a leisure space. But I'll hand over to Nick, because I'm sure he's got more.
Oh, no, I just want to say, you're probably familiar with Charlie Massey and his work. So he actually has been going out to many farmer forums right across the country and internationally as well. And his book, The Call of the Reed Warbler, which is another great text, an important book that everyone should read, has, I think resonated. And there is, I would agree with you, I think there's a real openness and willingness amongst many farmers to go through that shift that he describes in his book, and the many farmers that he speaks, tells their stories of I think he puts it from a kind of industrial mindset to a neo-organic mindset and a different type of relationship to the land, which I think is something that Chris picks up in his book as well, talking about the dialogue that can take place through the emerging regenerative farming movement that's, I think, sweeping around this country. Massey talks of it as an underground insurgency, and I think there's there's a lot in that. So yes, I mean these forums often do happen in Melbourne, but many of them don't, and there are dialogues about farmers speaking to farmers. I'd also want to kind of I guess myself just question the kind of urban rural binary and the urban master subject in a kind of like saying us who live in cities are somehow opposed to people who live in country. I think. There's great asymmetries and inequalities in cities themselves, and a lot of people doing it very tough in cities. So I think the divide is more, from to put a kind of slightly Marxist capitalist perspective on it, from the people who are pulling the strings, who can, the multi-millionaires and billionaires who are making most of the decisions, and the rest of us who are struggling to, make ends meet and get by as best we can. I think that's where the commonalities and the opportunities for, solidarity lie between, city people and farmers and Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians.
And just to clarify, I mean, that when we talk about those dualisms, it's very much at that level of symbolism, which is where do the repositories of power icons lie, as opposed to necessarily mapping people. But I take your point, it's very important to talk about the diversity within all these groups as well, and all categories, obscure as well as reveal.
Thanks a lot. Just today I've been working on looking at some political analysis on sort of the Murray-Darling, and just having this discussion, and John's really good point about native title as well. Been thinking about this, emerging tension and this rural urban divide, and how it's coming out politically, in March. I think the New South Wales state election, those two seats, Barwon and Murray, were won, getting 98% swings in Wilcannia, in Menindee, in Walgett, those towns that are really hard hit, but also have huge Aboriginal populations, and are really calling for that kind of water sovereignty that they don't get throughout the current Murray-Darling Basin Authority. But I guess turning towards that political party that a lot of urban people would sort of poo-poo and say they're too hard right and not representing the kind of progressive, sustainable politics that we've discussed today. And I was wondering if there's any comment on politically where these communities can turn, I work on treaties, so last year in the treaty debate, the shooters, fishers, farmers guys were saying we could provisionally support treaty theoretically if recreational rights were guaranteed for people who want to hunt and fish on Aboriginal land and under treaty lands. So it seems this really been sort of trying to work this out.
I have some problems with that because no one stops them from fishing. It's a $5 license. No one stops them from doing anything. I think it's a very convenient argument to try to get votes. And those representatives, those two in particular, I understand what you're saying, and I understand the discontent, that generates that kind of response. But they have elected two loopies. One of them advocates the clearing of the lower lakes, in South Australia. I mean, that's lunacy. And some of the other, and they advocate the abolition of the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. And those people, because they're discontent, they vote for that. They said, we don't want the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. Because in fact, the Murray-Darling Basin Plan has delivered a bucket of no water for them. And so they're turning the anger towards the plan and not the mismanagement of the plan, which was mostly undertaken by or caused by Barnaby Joyce, because they are at heart National Party people, and they return to the fold at the next opportunity. So that is, why I look at them with some degree of sympathy and a degree of antipathy, because they will return to the fold. Don't you worry about that, young man.
This is a question for you guys in general, but when you turn your minds to food systems that exist in the world today that aren't built on land that's been taken or killed for, where do your thoughts go there?
I'd say Nick has spent most time looking at that question.
Are there such lands?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. I don't know that there are a lot of kind of pristine, untouched places left. Really, we're in a global system, and it's colonised the whole planet. Perhaps in Canada, maybe in some of the more northern Indigenous areas of Canada, perhaps, and as we've heard in some of the areas of Australia as well.
Those groups have killed for that land as well.
Killed for it in the sense of what do you say, fought wars,
like
or
whoever's standing there now to kill someone else to get that land, probably.
No, I'm not sure that's necessarily true, and you could probably speak to what's happening in Australia, but I think the point Chris makes, and I think it's relevant for us to remember here, is that Aboriginal people were in this country for a very long period of time. Like Bruce Pascoe suggests that it's upwards of 80,000 years, and they lived here. In the map that Lauren showed us, there were hundreds, as many as perhaps as 600 different linguistic groups, cultural groups that were living here successfully. And Pascoe talks about not just their food systems, but their social systems and how they managed land and space and got along on the whole. I'm sure there were conflicts and tensions, but they weren't killing each other and engaging in genocide. They coexisted, and they managed this space, and they fed themselves, and they fed themselves well. So, and I think it's not so much a case of going back to the past. I don't think we can go back, but going forward in ways that recover that knowledge and combine it with our ecological understandings and knowledge about soil microbiology and coevolution of plants, animals and humans and these kinds of things. And we have modern science that can that can help us get a long way to where we need to get to, and that's the promise, I think, of regenerative agriculture. One of the farmers that Massey features in his book, the Haggertys in the wheat belt of Western Australia, a terribly degraded landscape. They're restoring tens of thousands of hectares through, sustainable regenerative land management and doing it very well, and including, reforesting and creating biodiversity habitats. So I think those are the hopes, and there's many, many examples that you could look at. Alan Savory in Zimbabwe and many others around the world. But I think, just to finish off, I think the point, and pick up on the further question back there as well, that what we need to be doing is having conversations like this, actually talking about these issues. I don't think we do that enough. And that was the idea of actually the People's Food Plan, and the inspiration for that was a process in Canada, the People's Food Policy process. Thousands of Canadians in that case having conversations like this, just no assumptions, nothing taken for granted, nothing saying it's got to be this way. We've got to focus on economic growth and business profitability. No, it was just saying, what are your hopes and dreams and concerns about your food system, and how can we work together to improve it? So I think that's, for me, the empowering potential of food sovereignty and Indigenous food sovereignty is that kind of dialogue that doesn't begin from assumptions, but is an open, honest conversation, and it foregrounds issues like what's happening in the Murray-Darling. So my friend and colleague Michelle Maloney from the Australian Earth Laws Alliance took some lawyers out to Wilcannia and Menindee and did a citizens' jury process where they allowed those people to give evidence and testimony about how they felt and how they'd not been listened to, and express what they were seeing and feeling and living. And I think we need a lot more of that, quite frankly. If governments aren't going to do it, if the media aren't going to talk about it, then why don't we? Why don't we start having these conversations ourselves? Which is why it's great to be here tonight.
Just to pick up the spirit of your question, I think it's a really good one in that it's about, how far back do you go? And in a lot of Australia, it's a fairly sort of, I guess, simple answer in a sense that we haven't had, layers and layers of different contested settlement, etc. But in other parts of the world, and perhaps in some parts of Australia, it is a much more contested question. And there's obviously something very, very special about First Nations. Does this concept of food sovereignty also have space in it for other marginalised groups? And so in America, for example, there's been quite a lot of work on recognising Black Americans' rights to land, to farm in an urban agriculture context, recognising their history through plantations and slavery. And that's quite a different argument and story to make for Indigenous Americans as well. And so this is what I love about Chris's book. It opens up all of these things, and there's not necessarily one recipe for all of these things. They're very, very different and very particular. But that's what I took from your question, was just this social complexity that we need to ask while respecting the core difference of First Nations rights.
Stefano, would you like to?
No, there's people who want to.
I might take two more questions. I've got 4 questions now. 4 questions quite succinctly, if possible. We might take them together and then invite our panellists to say what they would like to say in return, and then we'll have some wine and some food. Kevin.
Just briefly, I think it might be worth considering the story of Red Ochre, which was that restaurant started in Tandanya, which was an Aboriginal cuisine, and it was very successful. And I think there was a branch in Melbourne and Little Bourke Street which failed. But the story is that it was quite popular, particularly in Adelaide, where they've got a taste for kangaroo and native foods. But in places like Alice Springs, it became a destination for tourist buses to get the camel steak that they could tell a story about back home. So in a sense, it became exoticized as a touristic experience. But I wonder whether there's still a lost opportunity in that domain. It should be part of the settler-colonial dialogue as well, in terms of reviewing the way in which that particular aspect has been developed.
Yeah, terrific. Yes.
Maybe I should take the mic. I don't speak very loud. Yeah, Chris made a comment about Brillat Savarin, and one of his other aphorisms was that animals feed and only man eats. And I think one of the things that Lauren pointed to was how Aboriginal people were denied humanity and also agriculture, as Bruce Pascoe and Bill Gamage have demonstrated. And I think that we often see, when we talk about Aboriginal food, a kind of gastronomic reduction to ingredients and a kind of failure to acknowledge the stories, the multi-species stories, the cosmologies that are part of Aboriginal gastronomy, which has also been denied them in a kind of like a gastronullius. And I think it's kind of, it's ongoing. If you talk about the, developing Northern Australia, that's terra nullius, at work. And so I think one of the things that we have to do as kind of settler eaters is to step away from those stories and to allow them to be told by Aboriginal people themselves, and to kind of, I guess allow them to story this country in a different way.
I'm going in a completely different direction. We in a city which has a Can you not hear me? Normally people complain I'm too loud. We're in a city of where the population is growing by 2,000 people a week. So as someone who doesn't engage in this area, but who's currently working out at Tarneed, where you have housing estates, multiple housing estates, double and triple the size of Princes Park going up, where you have significant cultural diversity. As you've been talking, my question has been, how do I make sense of our discussion tonight in a context where every day I'm driving past these developing areas, and how do I relate the discussions we're having at one level about city-country with these outer urban areas which are newly emerging? How do I connect this discussion back into thinking about those spaces and what happens there? And Nick, in a sense, I'm partly looking to you because I know you're also doing some work out in, is it Casey? Cartesian. So I'd be really interested to get a way of thinking about the discussions we're having in a context like that, which is a very, very different context.
Terrific, thank you. And I've lost my fourth question. Yes, sorry, fourth comment.
Thanks. I'm someone who teaches first year undergraduate agricultural students. And so my question to the whole panel is, how do we both inspire and transform those young people who have chosen to go into agriculture? How do we move away from this idea of the rural urban and imagining the people who are practicing agriculture as being super conservative in their practices? And I guess, these young people now are going to be the farmers that have to farm under an age and era of climate change. So they are, to me, are entering the most exciting degree possible, because that's where the innovation and the entrepreneurship and the real potential for transforming our society exists. It exists with those agricultural graduates, because they're the ones that are going to have to figure out how to feed us all. And so I'm looking to the panel both as academics, but academics in this food space of just, I'm not quite sure what the question is, I've lost my track, but working with those young people for a future that we all want.
Terrific, thank you. Can we start with Nick and move along?
Okay, I'll just take the last two perhaps, and maybe others can pick up on the previous comments. So to pick up your point about Tarneet, it's a really, really difficult question. In Cardinia, there are 5 to 7 families moving in every single week. I think Wyndham is the fastest growing urban area in Australia. Cardinia is, not that far behind. I think partly it raises a really, and this is kind of like the idea of path dependency, that we've locked ourselves into this development dynamic that is not really healthy or sustainable, I think, in terms of the way people live in these suburbs. In Cardinia, you have people in cars, up to 2 hours each way on the Monash sometimes getting into work, which is just crazy, I think. And in terms of, the food environment, I think it's no different in Werribee and places out your way. Suburbs saturated with the fast food industry and people who are time poor and have lost the habit and practice of cooking and come home tired, and it's there and it's cheap and it's easy. It's what they call obesogenic environments, and this is just piling up problem after problem. So I think one way would just be to break with that whole development dynamic, and why are we so urbanised, and look at sort of decentralising some of our populations and getting people and building up our regional centres in Bendigo and Ballarat and Shepparton and other places, and having a more decentralised distributed population approach would be one. That means breaking the power of developers, which is a big challenge, a big battle, but perhaps it's one we have to face. Concretely in Cardinia, what we're doing is working with people to engage in the process that we tried with the People's Food Plan, a community food strategy that Council have endorsed, that has given people a voice, that is doing things like creating partnerships between the remaining farmers and new migrant populations, and making that kind of connection, and building levels of food literacy and giving some people some agency and control over their food system. So that's, baby steps, small steps, but at least we're making some progress. And I think that's a concrete action that is meaningful in the short term. Bigger term, there are much bigger questions at play. And in terms of young people in agriculture, I would give them Charlie Massey's book. I would take them to farms. I would, you kind of answered the question yourself in some ways by saying it's, the most exciting, inspiring career, one of the most meaningful and important that anyone, can go into at this point in time for the reasons that you've mentioned. And also because, there's a wave of change that's going around this country on farms and other places where, young people are at the forefront of that. We're a few years behind America, but, I think for the first time the age of farmers in America is now dropping because, that young people are excited and want to reconnect with the land and have a really meaningful, important career. So if America, in that sense, is any window into what a future might be for us, I think there's every reason to be hopeful about a future for young people. But I think creating pathways for young people to go into agriculture is really important. Partnerships with farmers, land sharing, community land trusts, like looking at innovative models to make it easier and remove some of those barriers to entry is critically important.
And just to follow up on that, I'd say teach them political economy and critical theory. Quite seriously, they're blinded by their education. It's at least the conventional education, which focuses on the science, but then adds to that some economics for diversity. That's not diversity. That's still reductionism, and it still focus everything on that individual. Whereas we need them to be politically active, politically aware, understand the structural barriers that they're facing and the strength that they can draw from the sort of solidarity that Nick mentioned, because it's that reductionism which is replicated in university systems as we know. It's you, your mark, it's your transcript. That's it. That's you. Whereas we have to think much more systemically. And there's a huge history in agricultural education of radical pedagogy, which I think can be really, really usefully resourced and repurposed and brought back. Agricultural education used to be this subversive type thing where you talk about all sorts of things like values and stuff. Get farmers. So there's a history there, a latent potential, if you like, in agricultural education that you could draw on. And just picking up on the excellent point about the reductionism around Indigenous food too. I mean, it's the same sort of, reductionist mindset where, some people receive fuel. They fuel their bodies as biological beings, as animals. Other people eat in a cultural sense. And it's that, you can see the lens I'm wearing here, but it's that dualistic human nature relationship there played out once again. You feed animals. You feed labourers, and then you go to your dining table and you partake in a cultural activity. So it's that sort of thing as well. So it was a very useful point.
On the culinary point, I think that's just to pick back up on that. I do think the allowing space and for Indigenous people to express and tell their stories about gastronomy and seeing food not as these reduced to kangaroo, damper, etc. But then the way they're co-opted as well, being sort of as I think Nick was talking about, the way that many of these foods are owned and profit to non-Indigenous people, like finger limes is, I think, one example that I always go back to. Allowing and not allowing, but encouraging those stories and those spaces, I think, is another way into thinking more about the whole political and historical connection. And with the education, I think, as we've already heard about the models provided, I mean, not that I'm wanting to go on about what else I research, but what else I research is the history of bioethics in Australia is something that I'm looking at the moment. And Paul Thompson, a philosopher of food from the US, has an interesting little paper on the way that in the US, bioethics got institutionalized in medical education, whereas at the same time, environmental ethics and agricultural ethics, this is all in the 60s and 70s, was developing, and some of the same people were doing this, but it never got institutionalized into agricultural training and schools and education. And I think part of the reason for that is bioethics partly got there because patients didn't like being abused, and patients' rights organisations sort of wanted medicine to become more ethical, and so there was niche for unemployed philosophers to get gigs doing that. Whereas in, who speaks and demands the sort of the rights of the soil, the rights of the lands and the waters, and so there isn't space for environmental ethics and agricultural ethics in those. But that's just a segue or a aside.
Going to have the last word, am I? Well, I just was going to give you a flippant answer, but then Lauren has given you a better answer than mine. But I was going to tell you that perhaps they ought to have more study of the humanities to begin with, because they're pretty narrowed. I went to technical school when I was young in Italy. I did agriculture. I didn't finish it. I came to Australia instead. It's more fun. But I did agriculture and winemaking. And the first 3 years, there was a bit of chemistry, but it was all humanities. And then the next 3 years was, so I came away, I can recite Dante by memory, but I don't know much chemistry because I found it impossible. But humanities are very important because these kids have no parameters. They just operate within a very narrow technocratic sort of, they have no idea. The other thought that I want to put here tonight is that we have dreadful departments of agriculture. Have you ever thought about these dicks in charge of allowing practices that are antediluvian, like these excessive use of Roundup, which has got into our system and which probably causes untold damage. So what I like you to think about is that instead of delegating the regulation to the Department of Agriculture, the various state departments of agriculture, which probably don't even talk to one another, what about a provocative idea, going back to the idea of a ministry for food? And one that, has real guts and power. So one that can say, we want to know in real time, how much water is being consumed in the system. You can divide the Murray-Darling Basin in a grid. There are various groups there, or entities, like Goulburn Murray Water, etc., etc., etc. They can give you a real time. We got the technology to know how much water is going and to what is going. Then we may even decide collectively as a society whether we want cotton or not, or what extent. Oh, talk about quotas, I'll be shot. But maybe we have to go back to quotas. Maybe we have. If you have limited amount of water and you don't want to have winners and losers, you may have to spread it. I want to remind you that cotton is now in Boort. Do you know where Boort is? Yeah. Or Cotton is in Boort. Cotton is nice. It is growing. It is nicely planted itself in Swan Hill. I've got photos for you to see. So before you know, you'll have cotton in your Melbourne backyard, I assure you. So maybe we need a department, a ministry for food, because food has got the health component, it's got the ecology, it's got the distribution, the who, the what, who has the power in relation to food, and maybe we need a vehicle through which we can all begin to have some sort of saying with. Anyway, just an idea.